Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, guys. So, what I decided to do is just kind of flip the classroom for a very brief lecture on the Revolutionary War, some of which we already talked about. So, hopefully, it won't take too long. Let's see if I'm right about this, and we can time this thing out to about 15, 20 minutes or so. We will wrap up our talk about the Revolutionary War with the very beginning of introduction to um, the principles, foundations, and principles of American government. But again, our topic here today is the Revolutionary War. We're going to talk a little bit about the northern theater of the war, the southern theater of the war, and the end of the war, abandonment, and the Treaty of Paris of 1783. I told you we had several treaties of Paris. So let's get rolling here. We talked a lot about the Battle of Bunker Hill, 1775. Um, so there was absolutely some confidence gained here. But some of the struggles that would become apparent in the Revolutionary War became apparent in the Battle of Bunker Hill. The colonial militia, the Minutemen, were incredibly, vastly underarmed compared to their British compatriots. So this line, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes," is indicative that they had very low ammunition, and they're going up against the greatest military that world history has ever seen. They had a strategic advantage in that they were on top of actually Breed's Hill, even though it's called the Battle of Bunker Hill. They're on top of Breed's Hill, so the high ground is always a military advantage. Um, but there they are with that advantage, but almost squandered that they have to wait until the British, the Redcoats, get incredibly close to them. Now they did lose 400 men, but they took out 1,000 redcoats, and so it was costly, but it was a victory. And as we said earlier, it really provided some confidence to the British that not only Thomas Paine was it common sense that we declare independence and fight this war, but that hey, we can pull this thing off, man. We can actually do this. As I said, there are some significant problems that the colonial militia faces, but they do have some strengths. They're fighting on home territory. Okay, they're fighting for a cause, ostensibly. Check Howard's in here. That they greatly believe in. They believe in this cause of independence. Um, they're kind of excited about this war. There's some emotional momentum, and it is again, it's their home territory. They know it. They have a large territory to kind of hide in, and that's very helpful given the fact that they are engaging in what we would call like guerrilla warfare. And we talked about that when we talked about Lexington and Concord, kind of hiding in the woods. That they're not engaging in what was traditional warfare at the time. Of course, there are incredible weaknesses. They're untrained soldiers. They have no navy. They're vastly underarmed, incredibly low on supplies. They don't have the economic resources to pay their soldiers on time, on schedule. That causes problems that Howard Zinn talks about. And as John Adams recognized, it's going to be a long, bloody war. Uh, Remarkably, not as long, not as bloody, not as costly, and ultimately a victory, which is an incredibly shocking upset. Again, against the world's greatest military. Talk a little bit about some important battles. And again, I want to do this kind of in a quick video rather than taking up class time, simply because again, APUSH doesn't really care. The college board doesn't really care about the battles per se. They care about the causes of the war, and we talked a lot about that leading up to here, right? The same causes of the Declaration of Independence. What pissed off the colonists so much they just had to declare independence. What triggered the movement for independence. We've ranked events. We've put events in chronology and so on. And we know what the effects of the war are. Of course, the creation of a new nation. But I can't just skip past the war. I think there are some fascinating aspects of the Revolutionary War that it's worth that we spend some time discussing. Um, One aspect of the war is the leadership of George Washington. Again, I call this man a legendary badass. He is one of the greatest American figures of all time. Flawed, yes. All historical characters for the most part are flawed. George Washington, admittedly, when we look back on history, he was a slave holder. He pursued his runaway slaves. Um, Not a perfect man, but was an incredibly important figure to American history, and in particular the Revolutionary War. But we're going to spend a lot of time talking about who he was as a president, which really makes him a notable figure. We know that he was a colonel in the French and Indian War. He took his first loss, right, at the Battle of Fort Necessity. We saw in the John Adams film his being named commander in chief. Um, and despite all that incredible leadership, the Continental Army loses a number of early battles, but Washington's leadership really kind of keeps the forces together. Sometimes, whether it's by hook or by crook, and quite honestly, by coercion at points. He has to exert sometimes some top-down leadership in, again, what Zinn would argue is some fairly negative ways. But you know what? Sometimes that has to be done, and Washington proved himself as a leader here in the Revolutionary War. I think it's important that we recognize the role of women and minorities in the Revolutionary War. Women have played an important part in a lot of American wars, and their roles often go unsung. I think that's the case for the Revolutionary War as well. Of course, they are not yet, frontline soldiers, but they're nurses, they're cooks, they're spies. Spies play a big role in the Revolutionary War. It's kind of a cool story. You're probably familiar with the name Molly Pitcher, right? One of the most famous battlefield nurses. So, just a moment to pay homage, to pay respect to the role that women play in the Revolutionary War. African Americans, Zinn talks a lot about this. African Americans have served in every military conflict in U.S. history, starting right here with the Revolutionary War. And they play a very important role. They fight in a number of significant battles, including Ticonderoga. And I think that was the battle that we saw depicted in the John Adams film when they captured the cannons from the British. Um, Slaves helped row George Washington in the famous crossing of the Delaware. About 5,000 free blacks and slaves served in the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War. And again, I think it's important that we take a moment, pay homage, pay respect, and just recognize their role in fighting for the independence of our nation. James Armistead was one such African American. He was a freed slave, and he acts as a spy for America. I tell you that spies play an important role. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. James Armistead works closely with our Marquis de Lafayette, who is the French leader that we'll talk about in a little bit. That Ben Franklin persuades to come on board. The colonial army is not going to win this war, spoiler alert, without the aid of the French. Um, Another spy is a guy by the name of Nathan Hale, who was a hero himself in a couple battles, including the Battle of Long Island. Um, he was a teacher, and he disguises himself as a Dutch school teacher. He does end up getting caught. He does end up getting hanged, and famously says, "I regret that I have but one life to lose for my country." Um, Espionage is a big role here. One of the most famous spies is on the flip side, Benedict Arnold, and he is his name has become synonymous with being a traitor. If somebody calls you a Benedict Arnold, they're calling you a traitor. He was an American general during the Revolutionary War who defects to the British. He was upset after serving as a hero in several battles, including Ticonderoga that I already talked about, Champlain, Saratoga. Um, but he's upset because as this war hero, he is passed over for promotion, and other officers kind of take credit for what he thinks are his victories, and he becomes frustrated. He becomes bitter. He is given command over what is now the United States Military Academy at West Point, and conspires with the British to turn over West Point to the British. Um, Word gets out to the Continental Army, and they come after him to take control of the famous traitor by now, but he ends up escaping. This is like a wild kind of story. He escapes down the Hudson River. If you know where West Point is, it's about like an hour's drive north of New York City on the Hudson, and he escapes down the river and gets out safely to the British and ends up becoming an officer in the British Army. Um, Survives and of course is well received by King George, but forever is known as a traitor in America. Let's talk about some of those specific battles in the Northern Theater, because that's where most of the Revolutionary War is fought. So a quick map here of some major battlegrounds, and you can see where we have some American victories: Battle of Princeton, Trenton, several in New Jersey. We're going to talk about Yorktown. That's more of a Southern theater here. We talked about Concord, Bunker, or Breed's Hill is marked here as a British victory. I would take exception with that classification. But let's talk a little bit about those. Starting with New York City, right off the bat, we talked about Washington suffering some early defeats. Right off the bat, the British capture New York City, and it's not a good look. It looks like that's a major right. There are kind of three major cities, right? Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. Moving south to north, there, it's a bleak beginning for the Continental Army, and the war had barely begun. Um, it's pure dumb luck and the use of some espionage intelligence that Washington is able to get his men off of the island in time. So the British capture it, but Washington's men are largely able to escape and kind of live for another day, as we say. The Battle of Trenton, New Jersey is a major one. This is actually a really cool story. Um, December 26th, the day after Christmas. It's, as the slide says here, it's a cold, miserable day. There's frostbite, disease. Uh, the Continental Army doesn't know that they're going to make it out, if they're going to win this thing at all. And this is Washington's famous crossing of the Delaware. So if you know where Trenton is, it's right on the east side of the Delaware River. The Delaware River separates Pennsylvania to the west, New Jersey to the east, and in Trenton, the redcoats are kind of, I guess, for lack of a better term, almost expecting like a Christmas armistice. Like there's going to be no battle, and Washington and his men sneak across uh, the Delaware River, chunks of ice floating through. We know the famous depiction of this, and they are not expecting an attack. And again, it's kind of emblematic of the guerrilla warfare tactics employed by the colonial army. Um, and they defeat a bunch of redcoats and the Hessians. Remember, the Hessians are kind of German mercenary soldiers hired out by the British. It is a huge, huge turning point that, again, not only gives a military victory to the colonial army, but gives confidence in the fact that they're able to do it. And that crossing of the Delaware River is famously depicted. I don't know that it necessarily looked exactly like the famous painting here, but it's certainly a famous image, at least in American history. And if you have seen this picture, this is what it's referring to. It's referring to the Battle of Trenton, New Jersey, and a huge colonial victory in the Revolutionary War. The Battle of Saratoga is 1777, is another major turning point in the Revolutionary War in favor of the Patriots, the colonial militia. Saratoga, New York, again, kind of southern upstate New York, and the Patriots engage in means to destroy paths for the British to send their men. They destroy bridges, they fell trees and do whatever it takes to limit and inhibit the redcoats' movements. Um, and they they win the Battle of Saratoga, and it's another major turning point because this is where you know that Ben Franklin is able to convince the French to come on board. And I said, we're not going to win this war without the aid of the French. But I think when we look back at Saratoga, I think the French are emboldened to take this step because they kind of see like the tide is turning and that the Americans, as it were, can win this war. And so that the French are convinced that they're not going to kind of like jump in on the losing side. That's important when we look back at like the French and Indian War, right? The Indians had become allied with the French, and when the French lose, they're left there like, uh oh. The French didn't want to be in a similar position. So they needed to witness some American victories in order to be convinced, and Saratoga aids that cause. The French leader that comes in to assist Washington and his troops is the Marquis de Lafayette, who is a notable French, kind of aristocratic but military leader. And he stays with Washington and his troops at Valley Forge. He uses his own money to pay the troops and to keep them on board. Uh, this is a classic, like the enemy of my enemy is my friend. I don't know that necessarily the French were like all that like tied into the cause of American independence had it not been for independence against Great Britain. So, kind of a cool story here of French assistance. And when we look back on it, the French are historically a very significant, notable ally of America, going all the way back here to the Revolutionary War. That moment where the Marquis de Lafayette comes in, I said, was Valley Forge. Valley Forge is an incredible story. When we talked about Trenton being kind of cold and miserable, death, disease, desertion, uh, Valley Forge makes Trenton look like a vacation. It is, if you looked back in like, I don't know what, like the Farmer's Almanac or something, hey, for that matter, any kind of history book, this winter is absolutely miserable. Like one of the coldest winters in history. Um, there is death, there is disease. The troops have frostbite and gangrene. The troops have like no clothing, little food, no supplies. 2,000 colonial soldiers, Washington's soldiers, die by disease during the winter and spring of 1777 into 1778. Another 2,000 desert the forces. And honestly, this is as close as it gets to becoming a turning point in favor of the British. The battle, the war, in fact, really could have turned on Valley Forge. But Washington comes in, and here he again displays his incredible leadership, even if sometimes that leadership has to be by force. He absolutely he stonewalls more soldiers from deserting. Um, he punishes soldiers that are engaging in, they're going out. Valley Forge is just outside of Philadelphia. Essentially, they're going into Philadelphia. They're partying. They're getting prostitutes. They're bringing disease back to the camp. And Washington kind of clamps down on them incredible. So, uh, again, his leadership is really on full display here. I realize that Howard's End takes exception with the leadership that's at play, but I might take exception with that characterization. Sometimes military conflict, the military is different than the rest of the world, and sometimes this type of force, quite frankly, is required. That's chain of command, and nobody understands military leadership. Certainly at this point in world history, probably greater than George Washington. So yeah, I got a man crush on George Washington. That's my boy. Here's just a little depiction of Valley Forge, and I don't know if this even does justice to kind of depicting how miserable the conditions are. But this is a national park you can go visit, and I've been there several times. you really do get a sense. And if you've ever been, even in a normal winter, never mind 1777, 1778, put it this way, it's damn cold up there. And then for it to be a remarkably cold winter, and just kind of, if we can imagine the absence of all modern cup fruits during an incredibly difficult winter, it's really is it's an amazing story here at Valley Forge. Talking a little bit about the Southern Theater, okay? Um, and again, the vast majority of the war is fought in the Northern Theater, but you're going to see some remarkable turning points in the Southern Theater, including a string of victories, and including, in fact, the ultimate victory. Um, One of the characters, and he is a character that we need to talk about in the Southern Theater, is, as I say here, the pirate like John Paul Jones, kind of known as the founder or the father of the American Navy. And remember, the colonial army had started this war with no navy. And John Paul Jones comes in and he raids British ports. He's got his major ship is the Ranger, um, and that gets badly damaged. And the British ask him to surrender, and he famously replies, "I have not yet begun to fight." And That's just kind of emblematic of who he is. But here we have kind of the entry, even if it's still incredibly undermanned, of the American Navy for the first time. The father of the American Navy, John Paul Jones. As we've said, most of the battles in the Revolutionary War take place in the Northern Theater. But In 1778, it's in the South that the British probably begin to realize, and Zinn talks about how most of the commitment from the day-to-day soldiers, even if it got tenuous at times, Trenton, Valley Forge, most of the commitment from the foot soldiers, who we know, I said, who wins wars, the boots on the ground, the infantry. So most of the emotionally kind of committed soldiers are in the north, and I think the British realize this, and so they begin to focus on the south and see if they can capture American colonies down south and perhaps then push up north. That becomes their strategy. So they capture Savannah, Georgia, 1778, Charleston, South Carolina, 1780, and the colonial army has to kind of turn its attention to uh, the um, the Southern Theater. So the Southern militia really get more involved here. Again, using guerrilla tactics, and what they're really trying to do is just kind of like chop at the redcoats. They can't fight them again in traditional warfare, kind of mano a mano. So that, like, we're talking like just kind of depleting them of resources, using tactics like they used up north, and kind of felling bridges, felling trees, and slowing and delaying. Um, the British end up going, they are slowed, but they do progress. They get into Virginia. Remember, in that like tidewater area where the rivers flow into the mainland, and they're hoping to be resupplied by the British in Virginia. We're getting towards next couple slides. We're going to be talking about the Battle of Yorktown, which is just outside of Jamestown, and we'll talk about that. But here come the French, and the French block off. They form like a blockade, and they prevent the British reinforcements from coming inland and supplying the redcoats on the ground. And this becomes known, or sets up, if you will, 1781, the Battle of Yorktown, where Lord Cornwallis, the great British military leader, ultimately surrenders. We will get to the another Treaty of Paris, 1783. But let's talk a little bit more about Yorktown. It's an absolutely pivotal battle. Um, Big one for the Americans. They travel about a half a marathon a day over 15 days to get their forces in place, um, to meet those redcoats driving up from the south. Thankfully, the French, as I said, had formed their blockade, and they are able, through incredible persistence, to move a significant number of troops into the Yorktown area and get there in advance of the British redcoats. And they actually, thanks to the French, again, um, outman and outsupply the French in Yorktown. The British are, well, it says confused, but like they're distraught. They can't believe that they're winning or losing this battle that the colonial army is winning. They're low on supplies now. It's their turn to be sick. They're running ragged essentially at this point. Um, and in a fit of irony, when Lord Cornwallis surrenders at Yorktown, um, it is quite literally, and here's a map of it. It's in modern terms, it's like a 30-minute drive from Yorktown to Jamestown. So, and on this map, we have Colonial Williamsburg, Jamestown, Yorktown, some incredible American history taking place in this Tidewater area. But this is where it happens, man. Cornwallis surrenders, and the war has come to an end. Famously depicted in this painting right here. Uh, Cornwallis surrenders to George Washington, and the British engage in what is known as abandonment. King George III finally now gives up the idea of controlling the colonies. Shockingly, uh, this guy, as we know, was not necessarily all that of a reasonable man. We've seen a couple depictions of him so far. We've heard, his responses to the First Continental Congress, his responses to the Olive Branch petition. But the writing is on the wall from a military perspective, and he has to abandon the idea of controlling the colonies, and the war has essentially come to an end. It officially comes to an end again with another Treaty of Paris, 1783. It ends the American Revolution. King George III recognizes the American colonies and the lands east of the Mississippi. So we had talked about kind of physical geographic boundaries, kind of creating natural political boundaries. The Proclamation of 1763 had essentially aligned right with the Appalachian Mountains, and now when King George III gives up, he abandons the idea of controlling the colonies. The western border of the colonies has extended from the Appalachian Mountains all the way out to the Mississippi River. And what we have here is, well, here's America, right? The United States of America after the Treaty of Paris is depicted in this admittedly kind of weak looking map. Um, but it doesn't quite solve all of the problems, okay? Great Britain accepts that the United States is now an independent nation, but other countries recognize that the United States is in a very tenuous position right now. They're a little tiny baby country just having escaped a war with a narrow victory. Um, uh, Spain is still involved in the United States. There's areas of dispute with Spain. There's areas of dispute with Great Britain. There are forts, especially kind of up in the north in Canada, that Britain refuses to abandon. Uh, and so there's going to be further discussion as we move forward in history about like, hey, what's up with like, what is the northern border of the United States, the southern border of modern day Canada. The idea here is, though, that America is not like all of a sudden, flying screaming eagles here. This is an infant of a nation, and its status is very much in doubt, and thus is going to begin this American experiment in democracy. And we're going to talk more about that, right, when we talk about the foundations and principles of American government and what this nation has to do just to survive its period of infancy. So the quest for a strong nation begins but it's not necessarily like a one step and done kind of deal. One of the themes we're really going to get into in the end of time period 3 and the beginning of time period 4 is the maturation of this nation from a tenuous one into a strong one. It hasn't always been, like I said, screaming eagles here. Now, of course, the nation starts with its Declaration of Independence. We talked about that the other day, and one of the top two, you know, three perhaps, no lower than that, important documents in American history. So we have this independent nation, okay? We have this young independent nation looking to become a strong nation. Uh, the next thing we're going to talk about is how how does this infant grow into, the screaming eagle? So we're going to open up our next class with America and its foundations and principles of government, um, which we will begin with this question: what is America's first form of government? That's where we're going to begin our next class. All right, guys. Looking forward to seeing you in class. Thanks for paying attention. I may have run a little bit longer than I intended. What are you going to do? Have a great day. Take care.